everyone. My name is Lauren, and I usually introduce myself like this. I'm a social worker and a mental health advocate who lives with schizoaffective disorder. I've built a career sharing my story of living with a serious mental illness, teaching people how to accept their diagnosis and manage it well. And that's the script. I've said some version of that so many times that I could do it in my sleep. And on one level, it is true. I was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, and I did build a career around that label. I did become, in many ways, a professionally mentally ill person, a kind of model patient who turned my diagnosis into my job description. But that introduction is also a perfect example of the problem that I want to talk about today. Somewhere along the way, I stopped just having a diagnosis and I started being it. The system trained me to organize my identity around being a person with a chronic, lifelong brain disease who would always need medication. And when I tried to question that, I was labeled non-compliant, lacking insight, even delusional. So eventually, I just stopped questioning. I tried to be the best mentally ill person that I could be. And we've already heard at this conference about the pipeline from distress to diagnosis to treatment, and about how narrow and predetermined most choices in the mental health system really are. And my story sits right at the intersection of those things. I was the distressed young adult who got funneled into a label, heavy meds, and ECT. I was the patient whose options were basically, take this path, or you're being irresponsible and unsafe. And then I became one of the faces of that system, on YouTube, on panels, in classrooms, teaching other people how to accept exactly the same story about themselves. And now the twist is that a couple of years ago, something happened that I'd been told was essentially impossible. I started working with people who saw my brain and body through a metabolic lens. I changed how I was eating and caring for my body. My symptoms went away. Little by little, and with support, I tapered completely off of my psychiatric medications. Today, I am living without psychosis, without meds, and with a level of clarity and capacity I was told that I would never have again. So, thank you. So now I kind of find myself in a bit of a strange position. I am alive, in part because of emergency psychiatric care and medication. And I am thriving because we stopped treating my diagnosis and my meds as my identity and my life script, and started treating them as just one set of tools in a much bigger toolbox. I really don't want to throw everything out, but I also refuse to pretend that the system is fine because I happen to survive it. I want to look at how the mental health system quietly trains people like me to become the mouthpieces of our own oppression, and what it takes to move beyond diagnosis and meds as the center of who we are. And I'm going to frame this around three myths, or three walls, that I had to move through. The first being that diagnosis is your identity and your life script. The second being that meds are the treatment and everything else is optional or add-ons. And the third being that a good patient is compliant, not powerful. So I did not start out as a mentally ill person. I started out as a quiet, sensitive kid who liked school, did sports, volunteered, the kind of kid that adults would describe as no trouble at all, or a joy to have in class. And I internalized that deeply. My job was to be good, to work hard, to not make waves. In my late teens and early 20s, though, that kind of started to crack, and I became more withdrawn, more depressed. I dragged myself through classes, and I just felt generally devastated about the state of the world and about how small and useless I felt inside of it. And then I did what I thought I was supposed to do, or what we're told we're supposed to do. I reached out. I told a doctor that I was struggling. I went to therapy, I started medication, and when things got worse instead of better, I tried even harder to do what the system asked of me. By my early 20s, my life had narrowed to just trying to survive each day. I was in therapy, seeing a psychiatrist on multiple meds, and still, I ended up in such profound despair that I tried to end my life. I woke up in the ICU after being on life support, and I did not feel grateful to be alive still. I felt like a failure. And from that point on, I was not just Lauren anymore. I was high risk, serious case, I was a person whose name in a chart would make professionals tense up. And this is one of the first quiet ways that identity shifts. You learn quickly that what you say to clinicians can determine whether you walk out the door or you lose your rights. I started doing this delicate dance in appointments. Be honest enough to get help, but not so honest that you get formed and they keep you in hospital against your will. And it became a bit of a performance where the stakes really were my freedom. And that performance slowly seeps into who you believe you are. In my mid-20s, things shifted again, and I started to hear my name spoken aloud when no one was there, smelling terrible odors that only I could smell, hearing voices. I generally knew enough about psychiatry to know roughly what that meant. And eventually, I had a manic psychotic episode and ended up back in hospital. That's when I got the diagnosis, schizoaffective disorder. But what landed in me that day was not just a name or a label. It was a story about who I was and who I would be. This is lifelong. This is severe. Your quality of life will be reduced. You will need medication for the rest of your life. One psychiatrist, angry that I was upset about being locked up and forced to take meds, told me that he thought I should probably be kept in hospital for the rest of my life. Imagine hearing that in your mid-20s. And so I pushed back. Intuitively, something in me resisted this idea that my whole life was now defined by a diagnostic label. But every time that I said, "This feels dehumanizing," or "I don't agree with that plan," I was told again that I was non-compliant, that I lacked insight, or that I was delusional. And so I got a very clear message. If you want any autonomy, you have to play the role of the good patient. And so I did. I took my meds, I showed up to therapy, I learned to talk about myself as someone living with a severe, lifelong mental illness. I became a schizophrenia advocate, making videos and giving talks about how to accept your diagnosis, how to be medication adherent, how to live well with this illness, this label. And that fusion, between being a compliant patient and a public advocate, it actually gave my suffering a kind of purpose. It locked my identity to my illness in a way that I didn't really even fully see at the time. It was also, I now recognize, a very sophisticated form of internalized oppression. And that's the first wall that we have to name if we're going to move forward. Diagnosis stopped being a description of some things that I was experiencing, and it became my identity and my life script. So now fast forward to June 2023, I'm doing everything right, taking meds as prescribed, in therapy, working in mental health, running a YouTube channel about living well with schizophrenia. And I end up in the middle of a full-blown psychotic episode. I was training for my first marathon and pushing my body in a way that I never had before, and I did not understand it at the time, but I was likely metabolizing my medications much faster. I was not skipping doses, I was not being reckless, I was following instructions and trying to do something healthy, and still, my brain tipped over into psychosis. For the first time in my life, I went to the hospital voluntarily, which really felt like a huge act of trust. Trust that if I showed up early and honest, I would be met with meaningful help. Instead, I got more of the same story, just louder. My antipsychotic dose pushed to the maximum, another antipsychotic added, and more meds put on top of that to deal with the side effects. I left heavily sedated and with very little new understanding of what had actually happened. And that kind of cracked something in me. It was the first time that I really saw that you can be the most compliant patient in the world and still end up psychotic. Simply stacking more drugs on top was not actually the same as healing. And it also planted a seed. If training for a marathon could change how my body metabolized my meds, then maybe metabolism is not just a side note, maybe it actually matters. And so a few months later, in December of 2023, I started a structured medical ketogenic approach, a very low carbohydrate, high fat way of eating that shifts the brain and body into using ketones for fuel. It's been used for over a century in epilepsy and is now being explored for serious mental illness through a metabolic lens. And we heard earlier from Jan about the movement happening around metabolic psychiatry currently. And honestly, before starting this experiment, I had kind of finally made peace with being chronically ill and permanently medicated. And opening this new door to the possibility of something different felt like inviting in disappointment, or worse, delusion. But it was worth a shot. And so I worked with a keto coach, Nicole Laurent, who we also had the pleasure of hearing from earlier, and together we built a plan, a medical ketogenic diet, monitoring ketones, sleep, exercise, stress, and watching labs. I told my psychiatrist, my family doctor, and my therapist what I was doing, and I asked them to support me medically, even if they didn't fully understand it. And to their credit, they agreed, though with very little curiosity, even as things started to change dramatically. About 2 weeks in, I remember turning to my husband and saying that I just felt more capacity. The first place that I noticed it with was our kids. I had more energy, more patience. I could stay present instead of feeling constantly on the brink of overwhelm. The day didn't feel like something that I had to survive. It started to feel like something that I could actually inhabit. Around 3 weeks in, I realized something even more startling. I was not noticing my symptoms. The hallucinations that had been a part of daily life for me just weren't showing up. My mood felt steady in a way that did not feel brittle or medicated. It felt really grounded. And as my brain began to function differently, my medications actually suddenly became too much. The same doses that had barely kept me afloat before now felt like someone was dragging me underwater. And so with Nicole's help, I learned about something called potentiation, when two treatments amplify each other, unfortunately including side effects as well. And so with my team, we started tapering, slowly, carefully, over months, though admittedly still probably too fast. I think it was initially Mark Horowitz who pointed that out. Thank you. I had no idea really how to navigate that in the best way, but I think that's a position that a lot of people find themselves in, unfortunately. But the farther that I got into this process of ketogenic therapy and reducing my psychiatric medications, the more it felt like my world was opening back up. I felt depths of emotion that I hadn't been able to access in so long, but still with an undercurrent of stability. It felt like a heavy veil was being lifted away, and I was reconnecting with myself and with my life. And then on September 14th, 2024, I took my last dose of antipsychotic medication. Thanks. But 3 weeks after that, I was on the phone with my psychiatrist describing very real symptoms of withdrawal, and he said to me, "There is no possible way that you're still in withdrawal. If you're feeling like this, that's your illness coming back, and you need to go back up on medication." By then, I knew my own body and brain well enough to know that that probably wasn't true, and I pushed through. The withdrawal did not last for 3 weeks, it lasted months. It's now been almost a year and a half since that last dose. The psychosis has not returned. The illness that my psychiatrist was sure was coming back has not. My day-to-day life had been changing in ways also that sound almost too ordinary to be profound, but if you've struggled with similar challenges, you know just how profound they are. I could trust myself to take on tasks and actually follow through. I could sit down with a book, read, and remember it. I could show up to my kids' lives with a steadiness and presence that I simply did not have before. And now, metabolic therapies did not turn me into someone who hates meds, but they did turn me into someone who can't keep pretending that meds are the whole story. And that's the second wall, is that meds have been regarded as the treatment and everything else was optional. And my experience does not mean that everyone can or should do exactly what I did either, but it does mean that we can no longer ethically tell people that their diagnosis is a lifelong chemical imbalance and that their only real option is drugs forever, while we ignore other powerful levers. So when I look back at these last 2 years, it has not just been a medical journey. It's been an identity journey, and a pretty painful one at that. I've felt anger that something this powerful was never ever presented as an option. Sadness for how much of my life I lost to a system that could not imagine this for me. Confusion and shame about how I built my identity around my illness and became a spokesperson for the very framework that was limiting me. And a deep loneliness, because when I stepped outside of that framework, parts of the mental health community that I had helped build turned their backs and framed me as dangerous. And all of that has forced me to see 3 big walls that my story ran into, walls that I think are built into the way we currently think about mental health. So the first one, again, was that diagnosis is your identity and your life script. When I was told that I had schizoaffective disorder, I was not just given a label, I was given a life script, or some might even say a life sentence. This is lifelong, this is severe, your quality of life will be reduced, you will always need medication. And that is not just information, that is identity shaping. In the system, we talk about insight as if it's this neutral thing. But often what we mean by good insight is that you agree that you are this diagnosis forever. You accept that your brain is broken and will always need drugs, and you stop questioning. When I pushed back, when I said things like, this feels too dehumanizing, or I don't agree with that plan, I was not met with curiosity. I was labeled non-compliant, lacking insight, even delusional. And so I learned quickly, if you want any autonomy, any chance of being heard, you had better align your identity with your diagnosis. And over time, diagnosis stopped being a description of some things that I was experiencing, and it became the core of who I was allowed to be. We build entire communities, services, and careers around these labels, and there are some real benefits, connection, understanding, resources. But there's also a cost. When your diagnosis becomes your main source of belonging and purpose, the idea of changing it or of recovering beyond it could feel like social death. And if you start to get better in ways that the system does not expect, it can feel like you're almost betraying your people. And so again, wall number 2 is that the meds are the treatment and everything else is optional. For over a decade, almost every meaningful conversation about my care revolved around medication. Doses, combinations, side effects, managing crises. Things like food, sleep, movement, blood sugar, trauma, stress, meaning. Those were framed as coping skills, as extras, not as central to what might be driving my symptoms. Think back to that June 2023 hospitalization. I came in voluntarily in psychosis while training for a marathon. My body and metabolism were clearly doing something different with the meds that I was on. But the automatic response was simply more medication. Higher doses, additional antipsychotics, then more drugs to manage the side effects. Very little curiosity about why this had happened or what else might need to be addressed. When metabolic therapy started working for me, most of my team was willing enough to monitor labs and write prescriptions for tapering. But even as my symptoms and my function improved, there was almost no curiosity about why. And when I described very real withdrawal weeks after my last dose of antipsychotic, I was told that that was just impossible, that this must just be my illness coming back. And that's what it looks like in practice. When a system believes that meds are the treatment and that everything else is secondary, it becomes very hard to see, let alone validate, anything that does not fit that frame. And now I want to be really clear here that I am not anti-medication. I am alive, in part because of emergency meds and acute care. What I am against is this idea that medication should have a monopoly on what counts as real treatment. I am against any story that says that this one category of intervention is real treatment and everything else is just accessory, especially when we're talking about drugs that profoundly alter the brain and body, often for years or decades without long-term mechanisms or exit strategies being well understood, and definitely not communicated to the people taking them. And now the third wall is the one that holds the others in place, and that is that a good patient is compliant, not powerful. From the very beginning, I was taught, explicitly and through force, that my role was to comply. When you've been stripped, restrained, forcibly injected, you learn in your body what happens if you don't comply. When you're later praised for having good insight and accepting your illness, your mind is being rewarded for compliance. We often describe someone as having good insight or being easy to work with when they tell their story in a way that neatly fits our diagnostic boxes and treatment plans. You learn that being a good patient means that you do not challenge the label, you don't question the centrality of medication, you don't keep pushing for deeper questions about your body, brain, and experience if those questions make the treatment plan more complicated. And now in my case, I didn't just internalize that, I professionalized it. I took that good patient identity and I turned it into advocacy and content. I made a career out of teaching people how to accept their diagnosis, how to be medication adherent, how to be realistic about their chronic illness. I did that because I genuinely thought it was the best that we had. But when I started talking publicly about metabolic therapies and tapering, it was like stepping over a bit of an invisible line. Parts of the mental health community I belonged to reacted with intense defensiveness, even hostility. My experience was reframed as rare, dangerous, irresponsible. I was accused of giving people false hope, of being anti-psychiatry, and of putting lives at risk. And I understand the fear, but we have to name what's happening there. We are policing each other to keep the old story intact, even when people are clearly being harmed by it, and even when new possibilities are emerging. These walls are not just individual attitudes either. They are baked into our training, our billing codes, our research agendas, our advocacy campaigns, and our casual conversations. And now here's the tension that I really want to hold in front of us right now. Most people working in the system are not villains. They are often deeply compassionate, exhausted people doing the best they can with the tools and narratives they've been given. I've been one of them. And I love the panel of psychiatrists that touched on that with nuance as well. And at the same time, the structures and stories we've built around mental health are, in many ways, oppressive. They strip people of personhood. They turn distress into fixed identity. They confuse sedation with healing. And both of those things can be true at once. And so the question that I want to hang in the air as we near the end of this talk is this. Can we sit with our discomfort about the harms of this system without collapsing into defensiveness or despair? Can we acknowledge the ways we've all internalized these walls, even when we meant well, and still choose to show up to help dismantle them from wherever we are in the system? What does it mean to move beyond diagnoses and meds without pretending that they never helped? For me, it starts with holding two truths. I am alive in part because of emergency care and medication, emergency psychiatric care and medication. I am thriving because we stopped treating my diagnosis and my meds as the center of who I am and started seeing them as just one set of tools in a much bigger toolbox. And so I just want to end with a few invitations, one set for clinicians and researchers and one for people with lived experience and families, but really they all overlap. For those of you who work in the system, can you let diagnosis be a working hypothesis, not a life script? Can you treat meds as one tool and not the whole treatment? Be honest about what we know and don't know, including about withdrawal, and make room for metabolic and other underused interventions as serious options. Can you see a good patient as someone who is powerful, not just compliant? Welcome uncomfortable questions, get curious. Collaboration is not the same as control. And for those with lived experience, you are not your diagnosis. Your distress, your hallucinations, your suicidality, your bipolar or borderline or psychotic episodes, all of these are real and serious and deserve care. But they are not the full truth of who you are, and they are also not a crystal ball into your future. And now if you've built identity and community around a label, I am not asking you to walk away from that. I know deeply how much comfort and belonging can live there. But I am inviting a gentle loosening of the grip. I have lived with this illness is not the same as this is all I will ever be. If you've tried metabolic therapies or other alternatives and they did not help or made things worse, that is not a personal failure. Our bodies are different, our access is different, our histories are different. Agency is not the same as blame. The point of opening up more options is not to shame the people who can't use them, it's to reduce the number of people who are told that there are no options. And for families, be allies in curiosity. And most of all, protect the personhood of the person you love. Remind them in words and actions that they are more than whatever is written in their chart. So when I think about what moving beyond diagnoses and meds looks like in my life now, it does not look like some kind of miracle montage. It looks like reading books again and remembering them. It looks like being able to show up to my kids' lives with a steadiness and presence that I couldn't access before. It looks like having enough energy at the end of the day to think about the future, not just how to get through the next hour. It looks like being able to say, I had schizoaffective disorder. I went through hell. I used the tools that were available, and now, with new tools and new understanding, my life script and what is possible has changed. Moving beyond diagnoses and meds doesn't mean pretending that they never helped, or that everyone can or should follow the exact path that I took. It means refusing to let labels and pills be the entire story of anybody's life. It means staying curious, even when that curiosity threatens our professional identities or our well-rehearsed narratives. And it means being willing to ask together, if this is what was possible for me, what else might be possible for the millions of people that we have told to lower their expectations of life? My hope is that we can hold our grief, our anger, and our love for the people that we serve and use all of it as fuel to build something more humane, more hopeful, and more honest than what we have right now. Thank you.